The relentless storm battered the forest, muffling the sounds of the pursuit, unfolding in the darkness. An armed battalion advanced silently, closing the net around the prey they had tracked for so long. The leader of the hunters finally intercepted the fugitive, mocking the long months he spent trying to hide in vain. There was a cruel satisfaction in the warrior's gaze as he realized the hunt had come to an end. The fugitive, exhausted and cornered, could barely breathe, but his reaction was a scornful laugh. The hunter's response was immediate and brutal. His blade descended to silence the insolence. The impact was devastating, throwing the fragile body to the ground and staining the earth with fresh blood. However, the executioner's next words cut deeper than the cold steel. Fear gave way to shock as the fallen creature understood the true nature of his situation. His entire escape, all his suffering, had been deliberately allowed by the hunters just for entertainment. The revelation that he had been treated like a mere toy made fury explode within him. The knight watched him with contempt, certain that the creature's will to fight had been broken. But driven by pure hatred, the vampire gathered his last strength and launched himself into a suicidal attack. The effort was futile. The death sentence was executed with a precise and fatal vertical strike. As his consciousness faded, only a bitter lament and a desperate wish remained. If he only had one more chance, he would do everything differently. Reality hit Eugene with the force of a physical blow. He realized that all his struggle had been in vain. The memories of that miserable hiding place resurfaced. He remembered how he gasped, hidden in the darkness, fighting for air. The panic was constant. Each breath was painful, a cruel reminder that he was still alive, but by a thread. The fugitive had lost count of how many times he looked at his own hands, trying to find the strength to continue. His body was broken, wrapped in rags that barely covered the wounds of a miserable existence. That hole in the ground was not a home, but it was where he entrenched himself, refusing to accept imminent death. Half a year passed in that solitude. He recorded each day on the wall, an obsessive count of his own survival. The vampire stood, although his legs trembled. He had become just a shadow of what he once was. The frustration turned into a clenched fist. Despite the misery, the will to live still burned within him. Meanwhile, the world outside continued indifferently. The sun rose and set, oblivious to the torment of that isolated creature. He knew his own weakness. To avoid being detected, he learned to stifle his own breathing and disappear into the shadows. Eugene accepted his insignificance. He crawled and hid, surviving one day at a time like a cornered animal. However, time was not on his side. A month turned into a relentless hunt by the armored knights. An entire year of escape culminated in that moment. No matter how much he hid, the hunters inevitably found him. The fear that kept him alive finally dissipated. All that remained was silence, and the blood spilled on the cold ground, ending his cycle of suffering. A cruel truth became clear to Eugene as he wandered through the forest in the rain. Dying in silence was not acceptable. The fugitive decided that he needed brute strength, enough power so that being found was no longer a death sentence. Under the witness of the moon, he definitively abandoned the prey mentality. The vampire changed his survival strategy at that instant, rejecting the eternal escape. The logic that governed his new existence was simple, yet brutal. He understood that the more powerful the source of the blood, the greater the strength acquired by whoever consumed it. As if fate wanted to test his new resolution, a challenge appeared immediately. A monstrous creature emerged from the shadows, attacking with murderous veracity. The young man dodged instinctively, feeling the violence of the blow pass inches from his body. The beast destroyed the ground where he was seconds before, demonstrating a power capable of crushing bones. AGM Dichak, Eugene rolled away and regained his balance, his fighting instincts finally awakening. He stared at the monster, no longer with fear, but with a cold and calculating determination. The fugitive steadied himself before the danger, ready to prove his theory in practice. With an inner roar, the young man went on the offensive, raising his weapon for the slaughter. The attack connected violently, tearing the beast's flesh and turning the hunted into the hunter. The fugitive realized too late the fragility of his weapon. The impact didn't go as he expected. The blade collided against the beast's impenetrable skin, unable to cause any real damage. The force of the ricochet was brutal, throwing the young man back and causing him to lose his balance in the murky waters. Although stunned and coughing up blood, he refused to succumb. His mind worked fast, analyzing the critical situation. The monstrosity gave him no respite, advancing ferociously to devour its vulnerable prey. Those weren't mere monsters from the demonic region, but roamers, natural predators that dominated the jungle. They were unique creatures that, even in areas without mana, developed powerful magic cores within themselves. For those who knew where to look, such cores were priceless treasures, worth more than any rare jewel. The vampire understood that if he took that core for himself, he could obtain the strength he so desired. He decided to turn the mortal danger into a unique opportunity, taking advantage of the enemy's charge. Ignoring any defense, the young man launched himself directly against the danger, seeking fatal contact. The clash between the two raised a column of water, dragging the violent battle into the depths of the swamp. His expression hardened. There was no more room for hesitation, only the cold determination of a predator. Even dragged to the bottom and trapped by the monster's fangs, he recalled all the suffering he endured to get there. He swallowed his own fear. The fight for survival had become his only reality and his greatest weapon. The creature fought desperately until the end, moved only by the primal instinct of survival. For it, that confrontation boiled down to the pure need to exist. Yujin, however, reversed the situation in the depths. The young man maintained relentless pressure, ensuring that his risky bet in the water paid off. He moved with lethal precision to finish the fight. The protagonist knew that any hesitation in that suffocating environment could be fatal. The monster's resistance finally ceased. In that brutal reality, defeat offered no second chances or alternative paths, only the absolute end. With the threat neutralized, the winner sought his prize. Yujin tore the beast's flesh, looking for the source of that mysterious power. He found the magic core intact. The raw energy pulsed within, promising the strength needed for his future survival. The young man understood the cruel nature of that world. All ascension and power were inevitably sustained and built on the blood of the defeated. The roamer's remains sank into oblivion. The battle had ended, leaving only the silence of the water as a witness. Yujin consolidated his internal resolution. He decided that he would no longer run. From now on, he would choose the path of combat. The protagonist emerged from the waters, leaving the scene of death behind. He walked towards the shore, transformed by the newly acquired victory. His ambition crystallized before the moon. He swore to himself that he would take both the blood of his enemies and total victory. The marks on his body reacted to the absorption of the core. Yujin accepted that new strength, feeling the power flow through his veins. Alone in the swamp, he analyzed the acquired ability. The black scale skin would now allow him to challenge his old weaknesses and limitations. The young man reflected on the intensity of the recent combat. The monster had been formidable, but the isolation of that place ensured that no one witnessed his evolution. He tested the transformation on his own hand. With that new power, he realized that daylight was no longer a death sentence. The swamps were a treacherous and little explored region, a place where civilization rarely dared to tread due to the hidden dangers. For a desperate fugitive, that dense forest seemed like the ideal hiding place, offering cover for those who needed to disappear from the map. However, the shadows harbored ancient horrors, predators that awaited any misstep from intruders to attack. Yujin understood that continuing to run was useless. His pursuer possessed a relentless ability to track him, no matter how deep he went. Aware that the enemy could smell his nature, the vampire decided to change his strategy. Instead of hiding, he would accumulate power to confront the holy knights head-on. However, the night was coming to an end. He concluded that it was still too early to test the limits of the mana crystal, and decided to retreat before dawn. As he prepared to leave, his mind was consumed by hatred for the false master, who had usurped everything that belonged to him. Suddenly, a mystical presence interrupted his thoughts, condemning him for staining that sacred ground with blood without permission. From the fluid energies of the forest, a guardian entity emerged, materializing to confront the intruder who dared to desecrate its home. The spirit aggressively claimed that area as its exclusive territory, trying to intimidate the vampire with its local authority. The creature displayed a menacing smile, ready to punish the insolence of the one who had disturbed the peace of the swamps. The protagonist, however, remained impassive. He simply crossed his arms and watched the little fairy with calculated disinterest. The mood changed when the fairy realized that the vampire could see and hear her. There was an awkward moment as they confirmed that her insult had been heard. The creature's posture instantly crumbled. Faced with Eugene's oppressive presence, she abandoned her arrogance and bowed in total submission. Trying to get around the situation, the fairy quickly changed her tone, thanking the vampire for eliminating the monster that had been terrorizing her. Eugene felt the burning of the marks on his skin. For him, those scars were not battle trophies, but constant reminders of a bloody past. The vampire reflected on the origin of those inscriptions. They represented each life he was forced to take, a macabre count engraved on his own body. He knew he couldn't erase what he had done. The story of his sins was burned on his back, a burden he would carry forever. The memory of his former master surfaced. The old man claimed to desire only a peaceful existence, a lie that now sounded bitter to the betrayed disciple. The guardian fairy, however, interrupted his thoughts. Surprised by his sudden departure, the little creature desperately tried to start a conversation to keep him there. She had been lonely for a long time and didn't want to lose her only company. The spirit of the forest tried to strike up a conversation, questioning his plans for the swamp. Eugene remained indifferent to the chatter. He already had his own goals mapped out and had no time to waste on the fairy's needs. Insistently, the guardian offered a magical reward. She promised that her special water could transform his appearance if he accepted the gift. The creature conjured the mystical liquid, begging him to drink it. It was a pathetic attempt to buy the traveler's attention with beauty tricks. The protagonist coldly rejected the offer. Without looking back, he left the fairy and her empty promises in the darkness of the forest, focused on his destiny. His journey took him to the edge of civilization. Under the moonlight, the small village of Broadwin seemed peaceful, unaware of the approaching presence. The sudden arrival caused immediate commotion. An elder was hurriedly alerted about the unexpected visitor waiting outside. The residents left their homes and gathered in the courtyard. What they found in the center of the village left them paralyzed. But the reaction was not one of terror. A huge pile of fresh game was heaped on the ground. Boars, deer, and birds had been slaughtered and left there as a silent offering. The initial confusion soon gave way to recognition. One of the villagers explained to the others that this type of generous delivery had happened before. Eugene carried the proof of his usefulness on his shoulders. The game was not just food, but the key to opening the gates of that place. Before the assembled residents, the fugitive offered the carcasses. He requested permission to enter, establishing a clear and direct trade. His gaze was intense under the mask. The vampire emphasized that mountain of meat served as advance payment for his presence there. The elder of Broadwin could hardly believe the amount of game. Stuttering, the old man tried to articulate a response to that generous and unexpected offer. However, the protagonist knew that food was not enough to appease fear. He raised his hand to his face, preparing for the final gesture of diplomacy. Silence filled the courtyard. Everyone awaited tense the next move of that stranger who had emerged from the forbidden forest. The villagers' distrust was palpable. The young redhead, unable to contain himself, demanded to know who or what was before them. Eugene removed the disguise, revealing his supernatural appearance. With a rehearsed smile, he offered his help for when the village needed it. The impact was overwhelming. The aura emanating from him was so intense that the residents recoiled, blinded by his magnetic presence and unreal beauty. The collective mind of the village went haywire. They tried to rationalize what they saw, wondering if he was an elf or a lost noble. The elder's shock, however, seemed to come from a different place. He stared at the visitor with a mixture of dread and recognition. Hidden, the guardian fairy watched everything. The little creature seemed incredulous at the audacity of that being to mingle with humans. The vampire explained his logic as he walked. For humans, showing one's face was an essential ritual for establishing trust and good faith. The fairy, floating right behind, seemed to vehemently disagree with that tactic, irritated by the social manipulation executed by the protagonist. The goal had been achieved. Eugene covered his face again, ending the performance necessary to guarantee his temporary refuge. The little fairy reacted with surprise to the revelation she had just heard. The original mission had a clear objective: go to the village of Broadwin. The order was to kidnap a specific child and take them to Sir Terwin's castle. However, the chosen method was extermination. To guarantee absolute silence, the mercenaries decided to eliminate any possible witnesses on site. The forest spirit was stunned, trying to process the cruelty of those human actions. Eugene, on the other hand, kept an impassive expression as the memories surfaced. He questioned what the real connection was between the mercenaries and what was happening now. Suddenly, the little creature shot off at high speed in his direction. She braked sharply right in front of the young man's face, forcing him to stop. Her playful expression disappeared, replaced by genuine concern and a silent warning. The reason for the interruption was soon revealed. Further ahead, an armed squad was blocking the road. The protagonist stopped in his tracks, realizing that he had been noticed by the man. The group of mercenaries stared at him with malicious smiles, clearly looking for trouble. The warriors exchanged quick glances, assessing the lone traveler as easy prey. Without any prior warning, one of the enemies jumped and delivered a brutal blow, ignoring the fairy's warning cry. The axe came down violently, threatening to split the young man in half before he could react. The vampire sensed the murderous intent even before the blow hit him. His predator instincts instantly awakened in the face of the threat. The mercenary brought his axe down with full force, believing that this surprise attack would end the fight right there. However, the protagonist saw this as a strategic opportunity. He knew he needed to win the loyalty of the locals through a show of strength. The little fairy barely had time to react. The impact was brutal, spreading violence through the forest clearing in a fraction of a second. The sound of flesh being torn echoed, but it wasn't Eugene's body that was suffering the critical damage. The fugitive decided to abandon any hesitation. To protect his disguise and his objectives, the only logical solution was the total extermination of the enemy squad. While the men hesitated, paralyzed by fear, the vampire recalled that the trust of others is often bought with the blood of their enemies. The forest guardian watched, stunned, at the supernatural speed with which the battle unfolded. The brutality was much greater than she expected. Eugene advanced, transforming his own essence into lethal weapons. His sentence was given. None of those invaders would leave there alive. Panic finally set in among the armed group. They screamed in horror as they realized that they were not facing an ordinary human, but a creature of the night. Driven by pure survival instinct, one of the attackers raised his sword, desperately trying to take down the monster in front of him. The steel collided against the target, but the impact was absorbed without causing the expected damage, as if the blade had hit an iron wall. The mercenary froze, realizing too late that his greed for the reward had led him to certain death. The fear in his eyes met only the coldness of the predator. With a fluid and merciless movement, the protagonist counterattacked. The blow went through the opponent's defense as if it didn't even exist. Chaos took over the battlefield. Eugene continued his relentless advance, reaping the enemies who dared to remain in his path. Driven by greed, one of the attackers advanced, shouting that the prey's head would be his exclusive trophy. The bold mercenary charged with blind fury. He brought down the heavy mace, confident that he would crush the opponent in a single blow. However, the attack was abruptly interrupted. The sound of the impact echoed, but the weapon stopped in the air as if it had hit a wall of steel. The man trembled in disbelief at that impossible resistance. Panic took over as he realized that his brute force had been completely nullified. Yujin was holding the enemy weapon with his bare hands. The vampire's gaze revealed a murderous intent, demonstrating the abysmal difference in power between them. With a fluid movement, the protagonist counterattacked. He ignored the mercenary's defense, delivering a swift and lethal blow. The impact was devastating. Blood spurted violently as the aggressor's body succumbed to the vampire's supernatural strength. The massacre ended in moments. Yujin stood among the corpses, aware that the chaos of battle would help conceal the true nature of his powers. Distant voices suggested a new desperate strategy. The rest of the group naively believed that by attacking together, they would have some chance of victory. However, when the villagers arrived with their torches, silence prevailed. The elder at the front froze, horrified by the scene he found. The place had become a slaughterhouse. The brutality of the shattered bodies and broken weapons defied the witnesses' understanding. The old leader trembled as he observed the result. He looked at the survivor, trying to understand how a single man had caused such destruction. The vampire waited in the shadows, watching the newcomers. His posture was calm and controlled, contrasting with the bloody scene around him. Upon facing the terrified group, Yujin justified the carnage. He stated coldly that this severe punishment was directed only at the guilty. The young man maintained his position, defying any objection. The villagers, illuminating the darkness with their torches, only listened, stunned by that overwhelming presence. The forest fell silent, leaving only the bodies of the shattered beasts scattered across the dark ground. Yujin waited impassively, crossing his arms. The elder, however, could barely process the scene unfolding before him. Panic soon set in among the men. One of the villagers screamed in horror upon noticing the state of the human corpses mixed with the animals. The brutality of the massacre was excessive. The man recoiled, shocked to realize that the bodies had been practically split in half. Another resident approached a fallen soldier, checking if there was still life in that pile of armor and blood. The village leader, visibly regretful, turned to the protagonist. He asked for forgiveness for having doubted the stranger's intentions. Yujin explained coldly that he had no choice but to act. The small guardian fairy watched the interaction, floating silently between them. The vampire's mind revisited the moment of combat, where extreme violence was the only possible response against the beasts. He had exterminated the threat completely, ensuring his survival and the temporary safety of the place. His eyes narrowed. Something in the presence of the forest spirit seemed to catch his momentary attention as the adrenaline subsided. Remembering something important, the young man interrupted his thoughts. He reached inside his clothes to retrieve an object. He pulled out a sealed letter, now stained with the blood of the recent battle, and presented it as proof. The elder took the envelope in his calloused hands. The initial curiosity quickly turned into tension as he examined the document. A terrible understanding struck the old man. The shock was immediate upon recognizing the hidden meaning in that seal. Fear took over his voice. The leader turned to the others, shouting desperately for the whereabouts of a man named Felid. In the tranquility of the tavern, the young man ate his meal, oblivious to the chaos that was about to unfold elsewhere. The atmosphere changed instantly when the dark figure revealed itself, emanating a presence that chilled the observer's blood. The knight sensed the immediate danger. His warrior instinct screamed a warning that came too late. The fugitive moved faster than the human eye could follow, turning the confrontation into a one-sided massacre. The soldiers retreated, stunned. The reality of the power they faced destroyed any courage they still possessed. Surrounded by bodies, the vampire rose victorious. The ease with which he eliminated his opponents confirmed his superiority. The last survivor tried to flee, but terror paralyzed his muscles, leaving him trembling and vulnerable on the ground. The predator did not hesitate. He advanced to finish the job with a lethal and relentless determination. The knight saw his end approaching, reflected in the merciless gaze of the one who came to collect a blood debt. With a thunderous violence, the man's body was thrown against the tree, breaking bones and hopes of resistance. The impact shook the forest. The knight slid to the ground, completely defeated and unable to defend himself. The vampire approached without haste. Now, the dynamic had changed. The former hunter was nothing more than a cornered prey. Faced with imminent death, the warrior's pride disappeared, leaving only pathetic pleas for mercy. Confusion took over his agonizing mind. He did not understand why he was the target of such specific fury. It was then that, upon facing his tormentor up close, the shock of recognition hit him harder than any physical blow. The fugitive rose above the defeated enemy, his presence emanating a lethal and dominating threat. With absolute authority, the creature claimed that territory, subjugating those who once hunted it. Fear paralyzed the knight. He realized too late that he had underestimated the monster before him. The protagonist stared at the man with contempt, listening to the pathetic excuses that began to emerge. He remained impassive, analyzing the situation with a calmness that contrasted with the chaos around him. Ezatsila Ixarsmel. The hunter, trembling on the ground, tried to justify his actions with a nervous and desperate smile. He revealed that it was all a dirty contract, involving political disputes and sealed orders from the high nobility. The real objective was the kidnapping of an illegitimate son. The large troop only served to guarantee the success of this vile mission. While the man explained the sordid details, the vampire processed every word, connecting the dots of that plot. Then the identity became clear. The young man recognized Verthal Tirwin, the commander who had turned his past life into hell. The human continued to humiliate himself on the ground, begging for mercy without knowing that his tormentor remembered everything. Memories of the torture and harassment suffered at the hands of that man flooded the protagonist's mind. Verthal awaited a response, the dread visible in his eyes as the silence became unbearable. The fugitive turned abruptly, walking towards something that was on the ground. He did not intend to offer forgiveness. His hand reached for the fallen blade, ready to end that cycle of hatred. The blow was brutal and definitive, separating life from death in an instant. The mercenary didn't have the slightest chance to react. The body collapsed heavily, silenced forever before even touching the forest floor. Jean Eugene caught his breath, watching the result of his implacable defense. The little fairy witnessed the necessary violence with apprehension. The fugitive knew there was no choice. That man had discovered his vampiric nature and needed to be eliminated to ensure the secret remained buried. However, the forest was not empty. Hungry predators emerged from the darkness, attracted by the fresh scent of blood permeating the air. Human voices soon cut through the tension of the woods. The residents of the nearby village approached, armed with torches and caution, investigating the commotion. The group found the mortal remains of the mercenaries. The elder recognized the victims, lamenting the tragic fate of those men known in the village. Luckily for Yang, the villagers' conclusion was wrong. They attributed the massacre to the wild beasts of the forest, ignoring the true threat hidden nearby. Hidden in the shadows, the vampire saw the perfect opportunity upon hearing the old man's erroneous deduction. Their ignorance was the disguise he needed. A bold plan formed in his mind. He decided to abandon the shadows and adopt a new persona, justifying his presence there as an act of nobility and duty. The little guardian was stunned, unable to process the audacity of that sudden and dangerous lie. The villagers recoiled, surprised, when the mysterious figure revealed himself. The elder, confused, questioned the identity of that stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. The spirit of the forest could barely contain its shock, watching in disbelief at the impudence of its makeshift companion. The protagonist maintained perfect composure, displaying a confident and charismatic smile to dispel any immediate suspicion. With total conviction, he introduced himself as a noble from a prestigious house, weaving a web of lies that the fairy doubted anyone would swallow. The villagers, agitated, demanded explanations. One of the men stepped forward, questioning the identity of that stranger amidst the chaos. The protagonist only smiled, confident. The little fairy by his side, however, panicked when she realized what he intended to do. With complete naturalness, Jean Eugene lied about his lineage, presenting himself as a member of a noble house to justify his strength. The crowd's attitude changed instantly. Fear gave way to respect. and the murmurs of distrust transformed into reverent admiration. The young vampire amused himself with the ease of manipulation. His spiritual companion, however, could not believe the audacity of that farce. In the minds of the peasants, the memories of the lonely boy were rewritten. Everything that seemed strange now gained an air of aristocratic mystery. They began to create their own theories. A decade of isolation in the forest was quickly justified as secret night training. The approval was unanimous. The residents connected the dots, convinced that the help they received in the past came from the benevolence of a noble. The village leader apologized for the lack of resources to reward him. Jean, pragmatic, accepted the gratitude and asked only that they leave him in peace. The plan had worked perfectly. He secured not only silence about the massacre, but also the blind loyalty of those people. The farce was established, creating the perfect setting for his survival in this hostile world. Back in the solitude of his cabin among the trees, the protagonist could finally lower his guard and check his spoils. Something had changed in his body. He felt the texture of his skin change, reacting to a newly acquired ability. The latent power awakened. A dark energy coursed through his veins, sharpening his senses far beyond human. The nature of the beast took control. In the darkness of the refuge, hunger and power shone intensely in his gaze. The monstrous mutation began to regress. The dark, sharp claws slowly receded, being reabsorbed into the flesh. In moments, his hand regained its human appearance. The vampire managed to suppress his bestial nature, hiding the evidence of his power. The fairy, however, remained skeptical of him. The little spirit crossed her arms, demanding explanations about what she had just witnessed. The protagonist ignored her hostility. Sitting comfortably, he warned that he would be leaving soon anyway, and demanded that she get straight to the point. The little creature insisted, irritated by his indifference. She tried to assert her authority, gesturing frantically to get his attention. He watched her with a calculating and bored look. The false noble knew he needed to maintain control of the situation, regardless of her complaints. Standing up, he decided that the charade would continue. The lie was the only safe tool he had left at that moment. The young man firmly gathered his belongings. It was time to prepare for the next step of his audacious plan. As he brought his hand to his face, he made a definitive decision. From that moment on, there would be no turning back or hesitation. He swore to himself to turn that invention into reality. The charade would cease to be a disguise and become his own life. The image of the grateful villagers came to his mind. They celebrated the arrival of a supposed savior, blinded by the hope he had given them. He recalled the identity he had stolen. The name and story of that young traveler would now be the foundation of his new existence. Under the hood, his red eyes gleamed with determination. The vampire was ready to bury his past and play his role to the end. He adjusted his equipment, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had assumed. Every gesture from then on needed to be perfectly calculated. The false noble walked towards the village. The journey to legitimize his lie and ascend socially had begun. The long walk along the mountain trail finally brought them closer to their intended destination. In the distance, the walls of the fortress rose imposingly, signaling the end of that exhausting stage of the journey. The young companions stopped briefly, noticing the ancient landmark by the roadside. The worn wood confirmed that they had reached the limits of the border territory. The protagonist maintained his stoic posture, ignoring the mocking presence of the fairy who floated around him. However, a sudden statement from the masked man caught the boy completely off guard. He stopped short, confused, trying to process the abrupt change in the tone of the conversation. The protagonist decided to use a tragic story as a shield. He stated coldly that his lineage was ruined, and he had no pride left. He explained that his survival, up to that moment, was not due to noble titles or studies, but solely to his skill with the sword. Without waiting for consolation or a response, the man resumed his march, ending the matter with a calculated determination. The young man followed him in silence, observing his companion's back with a new perspective. Beneath the mask, the protagonist maintained the charade, aware that the fairy perceived every detail, of his blatant manipulation. The little spirit could barely contain her laughter, amused by the audacity of that dramatic performance. The effect of the lie, however, was overwhelming. The boy felt not pity, but an immediate fascination with the tragic figure before him. Any suspicion the young man might have had disappeared instantly, replaced by blind and reverent admiration. The fugitive stopped in the shadows of the forest. Something or someone had interrupted his silent advance, drawing his attention. His heightened senses immediately picked up on the hostility. The killer instinct awakened within him, even before he saw the enemy. The protagonist maintained a calm demeanor under his disguise. The fairy beside him, however, seemed to feel the malice saturating the air. The young companion continued to smile, completely oblivious to the deadly danger that surrounded them on that deserted road. Suddenly, the vampire noticed the trajectory of a stealth attack. He focused his attention on the approaching projectile. An arrow cut through the wind violently, passing dangerously close to the boy's face. Death whispered in his ear. The boy froze, shock plastered on his face. The belated realization of the attack almost made him fall backward in fright. With inhuman reflexes, the protagonist intercepted the projectile in the air. He protected his ally without showing any effort. A group of armed men appeared at the top of the ravine. They looked down like predators surrounding cornered prey. One of the bandits mocked the shooter for his poor aim. They treated the deadly ambush as a simple, fun pastime. The young traveler began to tremble with uncontrollable dread. He realized that these men weren't there for a friendly chat. The robbers sized up their victims with contempt and greed. They figured it would be an easy score based on the traveler's harmless appearance. The gang leader demanded they empty their pockets immediately. The arrogance in his voice made it clear he wouldn't accept refusals. The protagonist, however, wasn't intimidated for even a second. He glared at the thieves, preparing to respond in kind. Without warning, the vampire lunged forward. His blade drew a deadly arc in the air, punishing the bandit's audacity with instant violence. The sound of the first body hitting the ground barely echoed before the massacre began. While young Philid walked around dazed, the protagonist moved like a wraith, reaping the bandits' lives before they could react. Instant panic gripped the aggressors as they realized they had ambushed a monster, not an easy prey. The protagonist felt satisfaction upon confirming that his agility and speed were exactly at the level he desired. The desperate attack of the bandit with the axe seemed to move in slow motion to his trained eyes. With a fluid movement, he intercepted the blow and counterattacked, turning the enemy's offense into his death sentence. Terror paralyzed the next opponent, who recoiled, trembling, before that overwhelming and incomprehensible force. The cry for help died in the man's throat, completely ignored by the blade that descended mercilessly. There was no hesitation in the blow, only the cold and efficient execution of someone already used to killing. With the ground now covered in corpses, the protagonist stopped, genuinely confused by the stupidity of those who chose to attack him. He tightened his grip on the weapon's handle, questioning the logic of the weak who dare to hunt those they deem even weaker. The expression of absolute dread on the last survivor's face didn't spark any pity in his gaze. To ensure the definitive end, he twisted the embedded blade, extracting a final howl of agony from the bandit. Turning to young Philid amidst the blood, he asked a philosophical question about human nature, as if he were in a classroom. The boy, however, remained static and pale, unable to process the casual brutality of the one who had just saved him. The young companion covered his mouth, struggling to contain his nausea. The brutality he had witnessed moment before still churned his stomach. The masked warrior, however, remained impassive. His cold eyes didn't show any disturbance with the blood or death that surrounded him. Leaving the forest behind, the pair continued their journey towards civilization, seeking a place to rest and trade. The city appeared before them, nestled between the imposing mountains. It was a bustling refuge, a stark contrast to the deadly silence of the woods. The local market was in an uproar. Vendors shouted their offers at the top of their lungs, competing for the attention of anyone who passed by. While merchants argued prices with fervor, The redhead boy was momentarily distracted, marveling at the chaotic energy and novelties of that place. He tried to get his leader's attention, but Eugene continued forward, completely ignoring the magical creatures and street attractions. The boy quickened his pace so as not to get lost in the crowd. The protagonist walked with determination, carrying his heavy luggage without showing effort. Around them, heated commercial disputes took place on every corner. Greed was the common language there, and each negotiation seemed like a combat. The hunter, however, observed everything with calculation. He analyzed the environment, looking for the right merchant to conduct his business. Upon choosing an establishment, he ordered the boy to wait outside. The young man readily agreed, relieved not to participate in the transaction. Without wasting time on pleasantries, the traveler threw the fruit of his hunt onto the counter. The heavy impact of the carcass silenced the surroundings. The merchant, a robust man, widened his eyes in surprise. He immediately identified the rare pelt and questioned how someone had obtained so many specimens. The seller's gaze narrowed, becoming calculating. His mind was already working on the exorbitant profits he could make from that unusual merchandise. The masked man noticed the change in attitude, but remained silent. He knew the value of what he possessed and awaited the inevitable offer. The merchant narrowed his eyes, analyzing every detail with a calculating and critical meticulousness. Upon feeling the texture of the material, he immediately planned how to take advantage of that negotiation, certain that it would be easy. The man laughed mockingly at the pile of carcasses, trying to diminish the value of Eugene's effort before the crowd. However, his arrogance faltered quickly. An oppressive presence emanated from the shadows, silencing his laughter. Cold sweat began to break out on the merchant's forehead. He realized, too late, that underestimating those travelers had been a mistake. While examining the product, greed fought against fear. The rarity of the item was undeniable, but the pressure was suffocating. The hooded figure remained still, radiating a silent threat that made the air heavy around the counter. The dealer felt a chill run down his spine. His instincts screamed that he was in imminent danger. Trying to regain control of the situation, he commented on the pair's supposed inexperience in the city, seeking a psychological opening. The only response he received was a deep, indecipherable murmur coming from the darkness of the hood. The prolonged silence eroded the man's confidence. Panic began to show on his face, contorted by anxiety. Eugene, on the other hand, seemed genuinely surprised. The young man didn't entirely understand the reason for so much tension. The murmur intensified, now sounding like an impatient demand that echoed in the seller's troubled mind. The merchant fell into internal despair. He interpreted that simple sound as a brutal negotiation tactic to extract more money. Defeated by his own imagination and fear, the man shouted out a much higher price, covering his face in frustration. The fire crackled softly, offering the only comfort and light in the deep darkness of the forest. Eugene reflected on the knowledge he had just absorbed. He felt that he had finally understood the essential fundamentals. The complex instructions of the ancient scroll were deciphered. He knew that he had executed the process correctly. Although common sense associated vampires with luxury and silks, Eugene concluded that the gold spent on that magical material was worth every penny. Magic flowed through him. With a precise gesture, he manipulated the water, testing his newly acquired control. The little fairy, however, was focused on another matter. She questioned about the cowardly merchant they had encountered earlier. The dealer, terrified by Eugene's intimidating presence and the slain beast, had paid a fortune just to end the encounter. The memory of that unexpected amount made the elemental spirit's greed awaken. Her eyes shining with the possibility of wealth, she flew agitatedly around him, unable to understand why someone with resources would choose to live outdoors. In her romantic view, a vampire should be a supreme noble, enjoying wine and comfort in a grandiose castle. Eugene ignored his companion's delusions of grandeur. He coldly reminded her of her origin in the spirit realm and the current reality. The fairy refused to accept his logic. The camping life clearly did not match her high expectations. While she complained about the limited usefulness of his magic, a timid voice interrupted the discussion. Emerging from the darkness, the young villager appeared, visibly confused and embarrassed. He asked who Eugene was talking to, since he didn't see anyone there. Eugene stared at the boy, realizing the problem. To the eyes of an ordinary human, he just looked like a crazy man talking to himself in the forest. The guardian fairy mocked the defeated opponent's fragility. Apparently, the protagonist's aura had been too intense for the creature to bear. Meanwhile, Eugene settled down to rest. The night promised to be long, and he needed to recover his energy. The young redhead, trying to be helpful, approached with a map. He seemed eager to share what he knew about the region. The silence of the forest enveloped the pair by the fire. It was a rare moment of truce after the chaos of the previous combat. The protagonist kept his attention on the boy. He listened patiently, assessing the usefulness of the information the boy had to offer. The villager explained that the journey would be extensive. According to his calculations, the journey would take about a year under normal conditions. This time estimated displeased Eugene deeply. He knew he didn't have that much time to achieve his goals. Noticing his companion's heavy silence, the boy hesitated. The initial confidence gave way to sudden shyness. To disguise his nervousness, the boy let out an embarrassed laugh. The tension of the moment made him visibly uncomfortable. Suddenly, something interrupted the conversation. The noisy arrival of an armed group put both on alert. The leader of the newcomers approached with a confident smile. He didn't seem intimidated to find strangers in the darkness of the forest. Eugene turned immediately, ready for any threat. The young villager, caught by surprise, just watched the visitors. The unknown warrior assessed the pair with respect. He concluded that they were experienced professionals, different from common bandits, despite the boy's presence. The protagonist, however, maintained his distrust. He coldly analyzed the intentions of that man, without letting his guard down. To Eugene's surprise, the stranger made an offer of peace. The group decided to share their supplies of food and drink with the travelers. The young soldier remained still, clearly dissatisfied with how events were unfolding. He turned to his superior, loudly questioning whether they would really accept this situation without objection. The protagonist merely observed the distrust of others, maintaining his cold and threatening posture. The group leader, however, found the tension amusing and responded with a carefree laugh. Ignoring the chief's laughter, the young man directly confronted the identity that Eugene had claimed. The soldier pointed out the inconsistencies, mocking the fact that the traveler didn't even have a suitable mount. He intensified the accusation, stating categorically that the masked man was not a real knight. With blatant disrespect, the young man poked Eugene's chest, claiming to not know his supposed noble family. The soldier's smile became provocative as he asked if all this wasn't just a farce. Eugene lowered his eyes to the finger touching him. That invasive gesture was a fatal mistake. While the leader just watched, the young man continued to test the patience of a creature far more dangerous than him. The protagonist's irritation reached its limit, and his violent instincts awakened. Before the soldier could react, Eugene intercepted the offending hand with a crushing grip. "It is a